So one of the things I love about our work at NISTS is that we get to bring together researchers and practitioners. And I know that many of you in your work are seeking out research to inform your practice and help you learn new ways and better ways to support transfer students, as well as to educate others on your campus about the need for resources for transfer students and just to understand who your students are um, and what they need. So I'm really excited. We've brought together 4 researchers today to share with you what they're learning and how you might be able to use that in your work to better understand the big picture of what's going on with transfer students and what they've heard directly from transfer students. So I think this is going to be just a great session. So let's dive in. So since this is coffee and current research, I've asked each of our panelists to show off their favorite coffee mug. I brought mine along. It doesn't have anything in it because I was afraid I might spill it, but this is from a local potter in our area. It's my favorite coffee mug. I think it's important to note these things during this time. The little things become important. Coffee has become important to me. So let's get started. Our first panelist is Darla Cooper. She is with the Research and Planning Group for California Community Colleges, also known as the RP Group. She has presented at several NISTS conferences based on her sharing her work of her multi-phase Through the Gate transfer study. Welcome, Darla. Would you like to show us your mug? Oh, Winnie the Pooh. Nice. Thank you for being here. And next we have Julie Wang, who is the Barbara and Glenn Thompson Professor in Educational Leadership at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She recently published a book, On My Own, The Challenge and Promise of Building Equitable STEM Transfer Pathways. If you haven't checked it out yet, I highly recommend it. And she is the current NISTS Catalyst Award winner. So welcome, Julie. Let's see your mug. Llama. Very nice. Next, we have Doug Shapiro, who is Vice President of Research and Executive Director of the Research Center at the National Student Clearinghouse. He also authored a great chapter in the Student Transfer and Mobility, or he authored the chapter on student transfer and mobility in the book Building Transfer Student Pathways that is edited by Mark Allen Poisel and Sonia Joseph. And I really appreciated the way he was able to pull together information from a variety of their data sources to really give a nice picture of the way students in general are becoming more mobile and how transfer fits in with that. So welcome, Doug. Would you like to show us your mug? Nice. Very nice. Okay. So we've all got our coffee and we're ready. Oh, wait, I forgot. How could I forget? John Fink. He is a senior research associate at the Community College Research Center. He's also a former academic advisor to transfer students. He has spoken and been involved with NISTS for several years and is a previous NISTS Catalyst winner. So welcome, John.
Ooh. This is a scene from Wisconsin, which is my home state too. So this is
very nice, very nice. Thank you. All right, let's dive into the conversation. I'm going to start with Doug. The National Student Clearinghouse has been tracking student mobility during this COVID time. So could you share with us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of transfer student patterns? We got a glimpse of this from one of our panelists yesterday, but would love to hear from you just what you're seeing and which groups of students are the most impacted.
Well, it's been a really fascinating and challenging breakneck term to try and keep up with all the changes as quickly as they happened. And first off, what we found was that transfer overall declined quite a bit this fall. 8% fewer students changed schools in fall 2020 compared to fall 2019. And that includes all directions. So not just upward transfer, but reverse transfer, lateral transfer, any movement from one school to another. And there were definitely, some kind of dire expectations and fears that really didn't come to pass. If you think back to last spring, there were many people who, well, myself included, who thought the pandemic was going to cause all kinds of disruptions, and there would be uh, students rethinking plans. Uh, they would have to transfer out perhaps of higher cost four-year residential schools and um, into more local four-year publics or maybe community colleges to stay closer to home, minimize travel, and save money. And second, there was a fear that those who had planned to transfer, uh, upward transferring from community colleges, would instead just stay put or stop out. And instead, what we found was really a lot more complex. I mean, first off, the number of reverse transfers declined steeply by about 20%. So completely contrary to what we thought. And lateral transfers too, those fell by 13%. So just the opposite of those fears about disruptions causing students to transfer. Most students, it seems, were kind of like deer in the headlights, not knowing which way to jump, and they just stayed put. So to some extent, that's good news. On the other hand, the number of upward transfer students did decline as expected, but only a bit, less than 1%. And that was all due to fewer students returning from stopouts. That decline was more like 5%. It actually increased among continuing students. So students who were enrolled in a community college last spring and transferred to a four-year institution this fall, if you think of that pattern, it increased by, again, only a little bit, about 0.5% compared to the number who transferred upward last year. And so you can imagine, going back to the stopouts point, if you had completed an associate's degree in 2019 and decided to take a year off, save some money, take some time before starting a bachelor's program, you might have held off on that in the middle of pandemic when spring 2020 came around and it was time to actually apply and register for fall 2020 at a four-year school. So that kind of makes sense. But the increase in continuing students making upward transfers was really a surprise.
Mhm, mhm. That is really interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about what the impact at community colleges and for community college students?
Well, so there was a huge, even regardless of transfers, the impact of the pandemic on the community colleges has been really quite staggering. I mean, very large declines in enrollments overall, and particularly large declines in new student enrollments, freshmen, first-time students, over 20% fewer first-time students starting at a community college this fall compared to last fall. And that's just devastating impact on the institutions. I mean, I have serious fears now about how many of these institutions will be able to survive, especially because funding from the states is way down as well. So that's very, very frightening. But when we also looked at freshmen coming directly from high school and looking at the types of freshmen that were enrolling in the community colleges, we saw most of the declines coming from low-income students from high minority and low-income high schools, and particularly Native American, Black, and Hispanic students. Those gaps in the kind of equity and access missions of community colleges, their ability to serve those students has been so compromised during the pandemic that it really raises a lot of other questions, much larger questions about how this crisis, like many crises, simply serves to expose and exacerbate some of the inequities that we already have in our society.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you for that. That really kind of lays the helps us set the landscape uh, as to what's happening now, and like you said, how it's connected to ongoing issues and structural inequities that have existed for a long time. Um, so um, related to that, um, first, I think I would actually like to just check in with you, Darla, since you work directly with community colleges. Um, do you see this what Doug was talking out playing out uh, in California with the community colleges, and how are folks reacting to it?
Absolutely. There definitely have been declines in enrollment, and pretty much the pattern that Doug shared with our first generation low income African American Latinx uh, populations. So nothing nothing different there. But if you think about the obstacles they were already facing pre-COVID, and how COVID probably in most cases exacerbated those, it should not be a surprise that those are the populations that are struggling to fit school in, or to be able to prioritize school when they have much more important things to worry about in terms of basic needs.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, so again, just in terms of setting the big picture, um, John, I don't know if you would like to share anything about, based on your work with the Tracking Transfer Project with the Clearinghouse and Aspen Institute's College Excellence Program. I know you all are tracking some specific transfer student outcomes, probably not including the impact of the pandemic, but just to get a sense of what you're seeing pre-pandemic.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, as Doug and Darla were talking about, this is really sort of that COVID is exacerbating a lot of the challenges in the existing system. And there were challenges going into the pandemic. And this is really what we had been studying with Aspen and the Clearinghouse. Really tracking cohorts of entering community college students and seeing their transfer and bachelor's completion outcomes. And the first look was at students who entered higher education in 2007. And we've subsequently looked at those who entered in 2012, 13, and now looking at 14 entrants, tracking for 6 years. Unfortunately, the sort of big picture outcomes have remained pretty much unchanged. So for every 100 community college entrants, we know about 80 of those are intending to earn a bachelor's or graduate degree, but only about 30 of them ever transfer to a 4-year institution. And at the end of the 6-year period, about 14 of them have a bachelor's degree. The system, underperforming as it is only working about half as well for Black students, only about half as well for low-income students. So we have this big challenge in terms of the current system. A couple of things we've learned is that the gaps, if we look at equity gaps, racial equity gaps, they emerge pretty early on. And even among sort of students who successfully make it through this system, there's sort of challenges. There's this sort of documented transfer penalty in terms of additional credits earned among bachelor's degree completers, or additional time to degree. I think one of the big takeaways for me looking at this system is just the vast pool of students at community college who are intending to transfer and have a lot of potential. But we see sort of a huge sort of drop off in the students who intend to transfer and those who do. And these national numbers suggest, if just folks think, I used to work at a 4-year, so I was thinking about the 1,000 new transfer students we're getting every term. It's these national numbers that, although there's variation by state and institutions, sort of suggest that you could just triple that. There's about 3 times more students who want to transfer. So I think that community colleges enroll 45% of undergraduates, they're huge sources of talent in our communities. And so really, you know, broader sort of theme of the research that we've been doing is how are we as educators and as, you know, not so secret transfer agents working to help our system be more effective for transfer students or more ready for transfer students, moving away from this mindset of, you know, students needing to figure it out and students being ready for transfer. So I think that's been a big takeaway. The other takeaway is just that, you know, although these outcomes are low overall, there's big challenges. There's a lot of variation. There's differences. Some states are doing better. Definitely some colleges and some unique pairings or partnerships of institutions are having pretty strong outcomes. This really suggests that policies, but in particular practices and what people do, what you all do, really matters. It makes a difference. So this is why this community of innovation is really important. And, you know, I think that like I always learn so much coming from this conference and talking with folks. It's harder to do in a virtual format. I'm looking forward to sort of continuing to get research questions from this group. But if there's sort of one takeaway starting on the strategy building here, it's just thinking through, okay, yes, we're looking at where are our transfer students going to, what are our top destinations or our top sending institutions. Oftentimes we're just looking at a number of students, but that sort of leaves out, you know, well, what are the outcomes of those students? You know, how many of those students are transferring in with an associate degree or are finishing the bachelor's after a certain amount of time? And what's the composition of that transfer group? You know, what's the racial breakdown of those transfer students and how does that compare to the community college they're coming from? So if we want to figure out sort of who are the students we're missing, who are that 3 times more students that we could be serving, I think that, you know, we need sort of disaggregating data, starting with data is really a good starting point for thinking through.
Thank you. It struck me when you said sometimes we're just looking at the numbers, and we need to look at the numbers, but we also need to look at the people behind the numbers. And so Julie and Darla, I know both of you in your mixed methods studies, you talk directly to students, and Julie, you highlight student voices in your book. So could you share with us some of what, starting with you, Julie, some of what you've learned in terms of what you heard from students, some of the structural issues that they're facing, and how we might address them?
Yeah, thank you, Judith. So I just want to take this opportunity to briefly highlight my key learning from this On My Own book, which is a longitudinal mixed method study that followed students starting at community colleges intending to transfer. The number of students intending to transfer is indeed, like Jean said, extremely high, nearly 75-ish% of this cohort of over 1,600 students intend to transfer. So I follow them for actually from fall 2014 all the way up till now, but the good book covered 4 years worth of time. So my key learning from surveying and interviewing these students is this On My Own theme that emerged. And so On My Own does speak to a lot of the structural issues, but before I get to that briefly, I want to highlight the internal facet to On My Own, really speaking to the resilience, talent, agency, and this just incredible motivation among these students. And so while we want to talk about all the challenges and barriers these students experienced and persisted through, I want to highlight them as assets. So On My Own does speak to the kinds of asset they are, but we can't default to they're On My Own just because they're amazing. So the external facet of On My Own reflects some of the structural challenges these students face. And to name just a few, number one is this lack of clear articulation in courses that count towards specific major. And then the second one is no clear course pathways in the case of articulated programs or courses that fit students' scheduling needs in light of their life, work, and other school obligations. There might be just this one singular transferable course offered at a particular time in a given year. And many students who are students of color who need to work and who are from low-income backgrounds, they just can't fit that into their broad schedule. And then the next one is just this utter lack of financial support for transfer students, prospective or post-transfer students. So the next two I want to briefly mention, they appear to be experiential level barriers, but they truly speak to the larger structural issues. And the first is this kind of inconsistent, incomplete, or just utterly contradictory transfer information students are receiving. And then the second one, which is really hard for students to reconcile. And then the second is this educational space broadly defined that doesn't always truly, fully validate and support transfer intending students who are from less traditional, so to speak, backgrounds and minoritized in often compounded ways, you know, women of color from low-income backgrounds and such. So these two issues are an artifact of a general lack of institutionally coordinated policy and processes to integrate advising into students' holistic educational experiences and to truly empower advisors and transfer supporters to do their work. So by pointing to these two particular experiential barriers, I'm not placing fault or responsibilities on individual advisors or faculty or other transfer supporters, because on my own, what I learned from this book and the students is that on my own is not an advising issue, but rather is a systemic set of challenges that constrains advisors as well. So as you can imagine, you know, all these factors, they are feeding into each other and particularly hurting the chances of upward transfer mobility of students from minoritized backgrounds. And these are already problems during the so-called normal times, and they're clearly magnified in the present set of crises.
Thank you, Julie. Darla, I'd love for you to share. I know that there were some parallel, similar findings. So tell us about the findings. Tell us a little bit about your study and your findings.
Certainly, thank you. So our Through the Gate study focused on students who were at or near the gate, meaning that they had completed all or most of their transfer requirements, but had not transferred. And our first part of our study just kind of was a quantitative analysis to figure out, well, who are these students? Where are these students? Those kinds of things, who might be more likely, less likely to be in any of these categories. But that only took us so far. And the question that we got over and over again when we shared those quantitative results was, well, why? Why are the students, you know, doing all this work and not transferring? And so we went, and the next phase of our study was to ask the students. So we found these students, we talked to them, we surveyed them, and we came up with 4 factors. We call them transfer capacity building factors. And they are first, and the most common, was university affordability. And that just refers to the fact that students don't know if they can afford the university. They don't have enough information about not only the cost, but what support is available, what kind of aid is available, scholarships, work opportunities, all the things that you can use to fund a university education. They don't know, and so they stop because they're not sure what to do, or they've already, you know, kind of said, I don't know how this is possible for me. I don't know how I could possibly afford this. The next factor is pathway navigation, and that is that students are not, in some cases, getting the information they need at the time they need it. Obviously, what a student needs to know about transfer in their first semester is different than what a student needs in their third semester. And then there's always issues of whether the information they're getting is up to date and applies to their unique situation in some cases. The third one is school life balance, which has already been mentioned. Our students are juggling a lot of responsibilities between family, work, and school, and any other obligations in their lives, and it can just be very challenging trying to fit it all in and ultimately prioritize school so that they can finish. And then the last one is support network, which is just having some group of people that support you in a variety of ways, from the cheerleaders that tell you you can do this, you're smart, I can see you being successful, in the future, to the ones who help you pick which university, help you pick your major, help give you practical advice about how to be successful in college. So obviously during the pandemic, with those factors, in particular, support network and school life balance, are being highly challenged, right? If you can't come on campus, it can be much more difficult to build a support network, to meet people who can support you. Also, a lot of our students rely on services from their community colleges, food pantries, clothing, mental health services. Those kinds of basic needs in some cases are not being met because colleges haven't been able to figure out how to give that support remotely. The other thing we looked at in our study is, well, how do these factors, how does the transfer experience differ based on student group? And what we found was differences in terms of male versus female for African American Black students, Hispanic, Latinx students, exited students, older students. And just an example for women and older students indicated that balancing family and school was very challenging. And they were also more motivated to have and want to go to universities close to home. So we've already seen how that's kind of affected enrollments in this COVID time, and that parents and caregivers are being more heavily impacted in terms of being able to do that balances, and how do you support them in a virtual environment? That's kind of one of the questions. The other one is that our African American, Black, and our Latinx students were more likely to say that they had used transfer related resources and found those resources helpful, like in their campuses, transfer centers and things like that. But again, if colleges haven't figured out ways to get those services to students in a virtual way, they're not sure what they're supposed to be doing right now. I talked to some students recently and they're like, I don't know what to do right now. I don't know what I should be doing. I would normally just, kind of pop in and see a counselor, or pop into the transfer center, and now I can't. So I'm not sure what to do.
Thank you for that. And I'll just add one thing that struck me that you all brought out in terms of the support network, is that sometimes students even need to they may not even understand fully the value of a support network, and they may not know how to build one on their own. So sometimes they need guidance in that as well. So thank you for all of that. I'm going to encourage our audience to chime in with any questions you have. We'll be watching the Q&A based on what you've heard so far. We'll keep moving, and we'll keep an eye on those questions.
Judith?
Yes.
May I go ahead and ask a couple of questions that have come in that are relevant before you change topics a little bit?
Yes, please do.
Okay, great. Doug, these tend to fall into your category. So there is a question from Sydney about what you are thinking about preliminarily for spring 2021 semester related to enrollment. And then a follow-up to that from Amy is the clearinghouse or potentially IPEDS thinking about categorizing institutions by reopening status so that perhaps we can learn the impact of institutional response on student outcomes, if that's even possible?
Yeah, those are great questions, and they are both possible. I mean, certainly we are working with some other research partners that have access to data on reopening plans about matching their data to our data, and we expect to see some results published along those lines in the next couple of months. So I'll be as interested as you are to see how those play out. on the question of, trying to predict what's going to be happening in the spring term, even though it's already started, we haven't gotten all the data in yet from the colleges. So we try to avoid making projections. All we have is this big magnifying glass, not a crystal ball. But personally, it seems to me that I don't see any big change that coming right away. I think we're still a long way off for when you think about the kind of challenges that Darla, for example, was just talking about that students are facing. I don't see those. I think it's already too late for spring term for those students to actually feel any better about any of those barriers to be jumping back into the schools right now.
Thank you, Doug.
I think everybody we all want to know what's happening next, and it's really interesting to think about. And it brings out the ecosystem that we're in, also with the declines at community colleges and how those might down the road play out with four-year schools. Okay, so John, I know you've also done some work related to community college students meeting early momentum milestones and how that can be a way, something maybe somewhat specific to focus on, that if they can meet those milestones, then it really shows some promising outcomes for them. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. I'll try to address a couple of questions here too on like the partnership from 4 years and the sort of partnership gap with community colleges. So I think in a pre-call, definitely other folks have kept on saying this phrase, like the system's designed for the outcomes it generates or something like that. Like there's a reason we have these outcomes, 100, 80, 30, 14, and I think that, this status quo way where basically the mindset is, at the 4 year, just waiting for transfer students to apply, we'll sort of just kind of be on coast and see those transfer admissions come in. And then all of a sudden now they're going down. I think this is just not going to work anymore. And I think what, is even more crucial now is this sort of outreach and collective action, really led by four-year institutions who are granting the bachelor's degrees and the master's degrees and the PhDs, to really sort of reach, backwards to the community colleges and help sort of create these better pathways with aligned supports and, from the time students enter at community college. And one sort of example of that and thinking about early momentum is sort of, I said that a lot of these inequities or gaps like emerge pretty early on. So just in the first year, a lot of these outcomes sort of play out. And so community colleges are really focused on sort of, what's in the first term, like what courses are students taking, what programs are they enrolled in, and are the courses that they're taking relevant and interesting and exciting and going to connect them to a faculty member and a network of folks that share similar interests, and they're going to be sort of engaging and propel them towards their goals. But right now, so take, for example, like the General Associates for Transfer, which like in theory could work out well for the students, but to Julie's point, they're sort of on their own to figure that out. Sometimes I've heard it called like a DIY transfer degree. Sort of it really puts the onus on the student to sort of arrange the courses that are going to apply to their bachelor's degrees, and puts the onus on advisors in a community college system that's chronically underfunded, with one study from the Center for American Progress showing that community colleges have 8 or 9,000 less to spend per student than public four-year institutions. So in that environment, so transfer advisors are supposed to know sort of every major for every destination, all the sort of ins and outs, which is a really tough, big lift, to say the least. So I think what we see is these sort of collective action approaches where the universities are reaching out and working to help build or sort of build those pathways for students. Think about things like the dual admissions programs, or other ways to, think, how do we take these to scale that, students start with this intention, and what sort of additional supports are helped to help students explore. So the early momentum metrics, I think, is one way that we've tried to operationalize that for college leaders. So what are a limited set of metrics that college leaders can track year over year to see if they're making progress in sort of getting more students to pass these early sort of milestones, like completing more credits, completing key courses like Gateway Math and English. One sort of encouraging study that we just released last year from looking at community college outcomes in one state was that, not only did sort of completing these early momentum metrics results in increased likelihood of transferring and completing a bachelor's overall, but specifically for Black and Latinx and low income students, we saw disproportionately stronger effects, increases in likelihoods of those longer term outcomes. And so I think this is like part of the takeaway from this research is that, if we want to close these long-term equity gaps, we have to close them in the short term. And I think that just in general with this research, if we want to address more of equity gaps, racial equity gaps, we need to be examining things that are having disproportionate impacts and looking for reforms that have disproportionate positive effects for specifically the students that we're seeking to work with to close these gaps, like students of color, low income students, et cetera.
And just to confirm, those metrics are things like the Gateway Math courses, and what else?
Yeah, so we look at a series of credit momentum. So our students completing different numbers of college level credits in their first year, persistence. And because someone else on this webinar, Julie, has done really groundbreaking work around broadening this conception of student momentum to include like aspirational momentum and motivational momentum. I should say, we're looking at a bird's eye view with like transcript data, which is very rich, and you can learn a lot from transcript data. But that's surely more to the story than just what courses students are taking. And so we're trying to broaden that idea too. For example, looking at momentum into programs of study and how, one sort of policy reform in statewide transfer has been to create more field-aligned associate degrees, like an associates of transfer in business, where like sort of pre-major courses have been worked out in some sort of like state council of faculty members, so to have better alignment there. So we're trying to figure out, do students who take those courses specified on those pathways have more momentum in those specific fields? So that's some of the future of where this is headed.
And I know it's come up a few times, and you touched on it just now, that the academic major or department, the fit for the student there, and the partnership between the 2- and 4-year schools at that level, at that major level, at the level of their specific program, is so important. Julie, would you like to chime in what you've seen in your work related to the individuals at the 4-year schools working with students at the 2-year schools?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And also, I want to extend beyond sort of the student level, because a lot of what we see in terms of inequities within the student experiences, as everyone has just talked about earlier, are also underlined by inequities in the system. So when we talk about a lack of smooth articulation between the two systems, community colleges and baccalaureate institutions, it's really a reflection of this unjust community college stigma, and also transfer student stigma, in the sense that a community college education is not valued enough. And so almost like transfer aspiring students have to compete instead of having a pathway that affirms the value of their community college education that they've already had. So I feel for any partnerships or at the individual level, if we're thinking about the 4-year end, to really work we'll have to just pause and check our biases and assumptions about a community college education and transfer students and what they bring to the table to just re-educate ourselves. I think this mindset shift is going to be pivotal. And then in my personal observations, the kinds of partnerships that seem to hold the most promise are the kinds of partnerships when the receiving and the transfer receiving end for your institutions, they really step up and to show that they're serious about transfer as an equity issue and view community colleges and transfer students and they themselves together as equal vital partners in this entire higher ed ecosystem. So I believe this is where not only we should emphasize, we should do the right things, but doing the right things alone is not enough of a motivation. This is where I feel a lot of research-informed education can happen regarding community colleges and transfer students as assets and successes, as opposed to always, thinking, okay, we're the 4-year, let's do the right things and to help community colleges and transfer students. So speaking of this does speak to some of my research on the contribution of community colleges in the entire post-secondary education. So just to name some brief examples, national data have shown, and I've done some research on this, community colleges not only receive transfer students, reverse transfer students from baccalaureate institutions, but also they have their baccalaureate co-enrollees benefiting from community college attendance, meaning their contribution is not just sending transfers over, but rather to expand and enrich baccalaureate education in the grand scheme of things for 4-year attendees. And also, I've done some recent research looking at the kinds of things community college education has equipped students with in terms of coping with crisis. And there were lots of innovative ideas. I'm happy to share the brief article in the chat next. But I feel here, when we incentivize our 4-year partners, we really need to think about this not only just as doing the right things or enrollment numbers, but rather this kind of partnership and this student population are going to enrich this entire post-secondary education for all students involved. And finally, I just want to give a shout out to my colleague, Jason Taylor at Utah, speaking of a very successful partnership between the transfer receiving and transfer sending ends. He's been leading this transfer pathways between Salt Lake Community College and University of Utah. And I'm going to post their website, and their model really embodies a lot of what I just described in terms of being equal partners, reciprocal and equitable partners, and then highly value the education of community colleges and the voices of community college leaders.
Those are really important points. I think especially right now when perhaps people who are working at 4-year institutions are feeling pressure from administrators to pressures around enrollment and recruiting from community colleges. It's really important to take a step back and look at some of these inequities and this and really the stigma around community colleges that has existed and how that might be playing out at their institution. How to to really get to know their community college partners and to educate others about that, about community college students being assets. And there are also studies that show performance of community college students at 4-year schools. They do well when they make that leap, as well as students who start there. So Darla, I'd be curious, one, in your since you work with community colleges, that's your world, if you would like to add anything to what Zuli said. There's also a question for you related to your point about pathway navigation, which I think is kind of in line with where we are in the discussion of talking about partnerships as well.
Yes, thank you. As far as the 2-year and 4-year institutions working together, we have many examples in California of wonderful partnerships that are really benefiting students, that are making the transition seamless, that are leading to students not just successfully transferring, but being successful after transfer. But that's part of the problem, is that it's local. It's dependent upon these institutions finding and working together and maintaining that relationship, so that it's not people dependent, which is what it is a lot of the times. One person leaves and the whole partnership falls apart. So there needs to be much more systemic ways of partnering, so that we don't have to rely on every campus has to figure out. It also limits the student to where it's like, well, what if I'm going to this community college, but I want to go to that university? that's in another area. My college is not going to partner with that one because it's in another area of the state. So there's lots of work to be done in terms of that. I did see the question, and thank you for that. I actually would like to answer it through an illustration of a promising practice that's what came from one of our a transfer center director who was on our advisory team at Crafton Hills College, where the need came out of COVID, but I'm pretty sure they're going to keep it even after COVID, because they've seen how much it's benefited students. And it was creating a canvas show about transfer. And it's basically geared towards how many units you have. So if you have 15 or fewer units, this is what you should be doing regarding transfer. Here's the information you need. If you have between 15 and 30, here's what you should be looking at. Here's what you need to be doing. If you're, et cetera. So through these kind of 15 things there, it starts with, figuring out, well, where might you want to transfer? It talks about the value of meeting with counselors. Again, it has very specific steps, very specific to-dos. It has the deadlines in terms of applications. It even goes beyond application. Okay, now I've applied. What do I do next? How do I get ready for transfer? So it really takes students through all those steps. And that's what pathway navigation is. It is giving students the information they need when they need it and helping them along the way so that they are on track, not just with their courses, but transfer is more than just courses. There's a lot of other things that you need to be doing in order to prepare yourself, not only to transfer, but to be successful after transfer. I'd also like to share something that just recently came out here in California that has promise. We can cross our fingers that, but it's just a proposal at this point from our governor, which is to allow students to dual enroll in community college and a university at the same time. So they would basically be applying and to community college and be conditionally accepted to the university, so that if they meet certain requirements during that time, they are admitted, to the university. And then the last thing, John, I think referenced that we have what we call an associate degree for transfer here in our state. That is between our community colleges and our California State University system, and that it will serve as a very strong foundation for this part of this proposal of having students be dual enrolled in the community college and the university. And so those are really key. Again, a promising practice at a very local level that again is an illustration of what it means to help students navigate their pathway to transfer, and also looking at some kind of a systemic practice that would help students navigate much better, because they'd have a much clearer picture, not just of what do I need to do at the community college, but what does my whole baccalaureate pathway look like?
Mm-hmm. So important to give that information to students. And the school you mentioned was Crofton Community College, is that correct? And I believe there's a webinar link on your website. Yes. That talks about that, where they do a demo, they show that site.
Exactly. It's Crafton with
Crafton, thank you.
With an A.
Thank you. I think now I want to just check in with Janet, who's monitoring our questions. I know we won't have time for all of them, but if there are any that we would like to address.
There are so many good ones on here, and I think panelists, if there are any that strike you as something you want to wrap your arms around, please do that. There is a question related to credit applicability and persistence to graduation at the 4-year. Just it's in particular around associate degree students. So kind of thinking about how that is playing out. And, again, is that another barrier? And are there ways that perhaps we can encourage institutions to note that and amend that?
Yeah, I've done research on credit transfer, much of which has been inspired from conversations with folks at this conference, and this difference between applicability and transferability of credits. I mean, that's such a key distinction. And I think that, well, first off, we know a credit transfer is often talked about in terms of cost savings, but it's actually, and that matters obviously a lot, but it's also really important for transfer student success. So you're showing that students who transfer most of their credits are 2.5 times more likely to complete a bachelor's. So this is credit transfer and applicability matters both for student success and cost savings. It's really, credit applicability specifically though is really hard to measure. And the folks who really can do it, if you have the technical capacity, which is challenging, is the universities through looking at like degree audit reports and excess credits among completers. And oftentimes there's just frankly not an incentive to look at that. It's sort of like airing out your dirty laundry. But one, I think, for universities that really want to tackle this, I think one useful framing exercise is to just go program by program or college by college, looking at, the total number of credits or excess credits among completers, or credits not applied to the degree among completers who were, started at the university or who were transfers in, to sort of surface where are some of our biggest trouble spots in terms of this issue.
John, I really appreciate that. And there's that distinction between being able to actually transfer into an institution and then at the program level. So getting that data down in the academic programs is really important to seeing the larger picture too. So thank you. There is another one. Lauren asked, is there research that we can access to demonstrate to our faculty around early admission programs, increasing momentum? You're putting great options in the chat, and I think that this is great. That folks are asking for evidence to increase their advocacy opportunities. Any suggestions for reading?
Sorry to speak again. I'll just say that I think that two places that have been profiled specifically at this is the Valencia College UCF Direct Connect program, as well as the work done with Northern Virginia Community College and George Mason. I think that's been written up in some different forms, but those are two key programs. We know the dual admissions idea has been around for a long time and has been implemented by a lot of places. In the transfer playbook with Aspen, we profiled FIU down in Florida having that, but we know this is happening in other places as well. The one issue I'd also raise with these, when we think about creating these you might consider these like higher opportunity transfer pathways, like dual admissions program or structured transfer pathway is specifically designed. So if those aren't happening at scale and it's sort of for a limited set, it's really important to be looking at who's getting access to that, and to what extent is there an issue there around sort of equitable access to these higher opportunity transfer paths, and really how do we scale these specifically to students who could most benefit.
Thank you. Anybody doing any research around free community college? We know that that will only continue to be a part of the higher education conversation with our new presidential administration. So there have been some good studies out there. Wonder where things stand now and where we're headed with those assessments.
I think a lot of rigorously designed studies to assess free community colleges, they're still under, I haven't, others correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen studies completely coming to fruition, drawing very conclusive evidence yet. But there's enough literature in terms of higher education, financial aid and such to suggest the promise of free community colleges.
Thank you. Darla, this may be a good one. Well, you've seen it in your research because you've talked to students who have made that 2-year to 4-year leap. And so Cheryl, from the 4-year institution perspective, is saying, how can we help community college transfer students that don't have an associate's degree, especially when perhaps they need to come to the 4-year sooner rather than later? It's kind of that slippery slope between ensuring that institutions get what they need out of those partnerships.
Well, actually, in our study, we found that the majority of students who transfer in California do not transfer with an associate's degree. So it's, however, there's also research that shows those who do are more likely to complete their bachelor's degree. So there's a bit of a paradox and conundrum there that we have not been able to solve yet. But I think it goes back to the partnerships and working much more closely with your feeder community colleges and having a presence on that campus and having those students see you. They need to see you. They need to understand. Figuring out how to bring the students to your campus when we can, or virtually, however that might look. But I think it's going to rely heavily on those relationships between the two, and a lot of it is presence and knowledge and access.
And if I could
Great.
just jump in there, we also, we actually found in our data this fall that the number of students transferring without an associate's degree had increased, while the number transferring with an associate's degree had fallen. And I don't quite know what to make of that, but I suspect that it might have something to do with increased appeals being made by four-year institutions reaching out to those students.
So just
Great
to
point.
confirm that you're saying that the 4 years were reaching out to the students before they completed that associate's degree, or maybe their admission standards were a bit more flexible.
Yeah, making efforts to streamline that process so that they could bolster their own enrollments, which was a concern as well.
And I'm sorry, if I can add one more thing, which is the programs don't match. What's required for an associate's degree doesn't match what students need to transfer. And so why, and I've heard this from students themselves, like, why would I take these extra classes that aren't going to help me with my ultimate goal, which is a bachelor's degree? We all have to remember, transfer is not the student's goal. They don't transfer and go, I'm good, I'm done, yay. That transfer is a means to an end. Transfer is how community colleges measure themselves and their impact. And we need to remember it from that student perspective.
And we are out of time. This has been a great conversation. I think that's a great place to end. Just a reminder to look at things from the student perspective and not get as caught up in the institutional processes, knowing that we still have to speak that language and our institutions have priorities and we have to learn how to advocate for the students in ways that address those goals and priorities. But ultimately, it's so important to remember the students' context, where they're coming from. And I appreciate that you all highlight that in your work. And thank you for this rich discussion. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of the day at the conference.